The Gwyneth Paltrow ski crash trial got underway on Tuesday, March 21st, just this past week. And although there is a lot that can be talked about in this trial in terms of the lawyering and the weird quirks that have been kind of happening inside that courtroom, in this video, I want to focus on the evidence that has come out at trial so far and why, in my opinion, personally, I think that at this point in time, Gwyneth Paltrow is probably in the lead in this trial. Let's get into it. So if you don't know anything about this trial, let's go into a little bit of background first. This case is a civil case, and it's a negligence claim over a 2016 ski crash collision incident that happened between Gwyneth Paltrow and a man named Terry Sanderson. Specifically, it happened on February 26, 2016 in the Deer Valley Resort in Park City, Utah. Apparently around 11:45 a.m., they both were on the Bandana Run at the Deer Valley Resort, which for some reason, my brain, when I first read it a few times, I thought that it said Banana Run, which it's definitely not. It's bandana, not banana. Anyway, so the Bandana Run is apparently a green run, which means it's not exactly a bunny hill, but it's between a bunny hill and an intermediate hill. In other words, good for beginners and not particularly challenging. One thing that all parties agree on is that the then 69-year-old Terry Sanderson and the then 43-ish, I think, year old Gwyneth Paltrow collided on that particular hill. When they did, they fell off to the side, and Terry Sanderson apparently got fairly injured. As a result of the collision, according to Mr. Sanderson, he broke 4 ribs and suffered a concussion and now has post-concussive symptoms. In other words, that's basically just where you have concussion symptoms that last for a very long time. This collision allegedly happened in February 2016, and apparently he says that he still has symptoms today. And as a result, he has sued Gwyneth Paltrow for $3.2 million. The reports on the numbers for what he is asking for in damages are a little bit different because I've seen some reporting saying that the max is $300,000. I've seen others saying that he's asking for $3.2 million. In the courtroom, they have said that his damages are valued at $3.2 million.
At the end of this trial, the evidence will have clearly and convincingly established that the value, not the cost, but the value of the damages done to Terry Sanderson is $3,276,000.
But anyway, there are 2 main disputes here. One of them is who hit whom. And the other dispute is to what can we attribute the injuries that Mr. Sanderson says that he is experiencing. On the one hand, he apparently had some pre-existing conditions before this that had to do with his brain and his eyesight and other neurological kind of issues. And so the defense is arguing that the symptoms that he has right now are a natural progression of those pre-existing conditions. But on the other side, the plaintiff's side, what they are saying is that he had these pre-existing conditions, but that those just made him particularly vulnerable to these kinds of symptoms that would arise from this kind of a collision. In other words, he was an eggshell skull plaintiff. The term eggshell skull refers to when the plaintiff in the case who is complaining about particular injuries has really bad injuries, worse injuries than what we might expect would come from this particular incident. And particularly those injuries would come from a very specific vulnerability that this person had. You can think of it as a 95-year-old woman slipping and falling in a grocery store and breaking her hip. Whereas someone who's 25 slips and falls, doesn't break anything, a 95-year-old woman might actually break quite a bit and then have greater injuries that she would be seeking compensation for from the defendant. And the idea here is that the defendant takes their victim as they come. In other words, where the defendant is in fact responsible for the incident, the injuries that result are the injuries that result. They cannot take some kind of a discount just because the person that they hurt was already in a vulnerable state. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because of the fact that we don't, on a policy level, want to encourage people to be risky around people that are vulnerable, or maybe even start to target people who are more vulnerable, thinking it's not really worth as much on the legal end if they were to get into some kind of a legal dispute. And so now the other dispute here is the question of who hit whom. Part of that is because Gwyneth Paltrow has in fact countersued Terry Sanderson as well. She is apparently seeking $1 in compensatory damages and then also requesting attorney's fees. And she insists that he actually hit her from behind. But Mr. Sanderson, the plaintiff here, still maintains that she's the one that hit him from behind. One issue is there are no videos here to help corroborate anyone's testimony. We are entirely reliant upon one witness who says that he saw the actual incident, and then several other witnesses who were there immediately afterwards and saw where they landed. Then we're also relying upon medical experts who looked at the particular injuries and say that they can tell who hit whom based on how the injuries happened and where they appeared on Terry Sanderson's body. So in this trial, there's kind of this focus on these two sets of injuries on Terry Sanderson. There's the ribs and then there's the concussion. The ribs testimony is generally focused on trying to reconstruct who hit whom and how exactly the collision happened. The concussion part, on the other hand, is really where the bigger damages would come from for Terry Sanderson, because he says that he is still dealing with his mental issues or with his brain issues because of the post-concussive syndrome that he says that he's still suffering from. Now, one of the things that I noticed here in watching the trial and watching commentary on the trial and seeing tweets and comments and all kinds of stuff all over the place is there is this question of, do you believe Gwyneth Paltrow? Do you believe Terry Sanderson? Who hit whom? Truth be told, you don't actually even have to fully answer that question on either side. And specifically, I mean, you don't really need to answer those questions in order to determine who wins here. The main question here is whether or not Terry Sanderson has met his particular burden to prove his case. So theoretically, the jury could end up at the end of the trial thinking, I don't really believe Gwyneth Paltrow's account. I don't really believe Terry Sanderson's account, or maybe they believe Terry Sanderson's account a little bit more, but it still might not be enough for them to be convinced by the level of evidence that Terry Sanderson's legal team is presenting at trial for the jury. And the reason for that is because the plaintiff is the one that has the burden of proving every element of his claims. And specifically, the plaintiff's burden is that he has to show that it was more likely than not that things happened the way that he said that they did. And so if the jury finds themselves ending up in this sort of muddy middle kind of place, the muddy middle goes to the defendant. In other words, if they're still left with enough questions as to what happened and whether they can really say that the injuries come from the place that the plaintiff says that they do, this muddy middle means that Gwyneth Paltrow would win. So what are the elements of plaintiff's claim? Well, he basically is seeking a negligence claim, which means that he basically has to show 4 basic elements. First, he has to show that Gwyneth Paltrow had a particular duty of reasonable care while skiing on the mountain. Second, he has to show that she breached that duty of care. Third, he has to show that he was harmed after this incident. And fourth, he has to show causation. He has to show that link between his harms and Gwyneth Paltrow's alleged breach of her duty. So basically, this trial is focusing on 2 of these elements. That would be the element of breach and the element of causation. So let's talk first about the breach element. Did Terry Sanderson run into Gwyneth Paltrow, or did Gwyneth Paltrow run into Terry Sanderson? As I said before, we don't have any video evidence. In fact, this is one point that the defense has actually brought up a number of times because there appears to have been at one point video evidence showing the incident that was accessible by the plaintiff, which is no longer available to anyone. This is important because this can create an inference for the jury that the reason why that video has gone missing is because the plaintiff, who was the one who had access to it, has somehow made it unavailable. And the reason why they might have made it unavailable is because maybe it didn't quite help his particular case. Now, of course, we don't know for sure because no one seems to have seen it, other than perhaps one of his daughters, who at trial said that she still doesn't remember whether or not she actually saw it, but she did send an email response to Dad's response with that link, basically commenting on this particular video, talking about what are the odds that a GoPro actually captured this incident.
I believe that I got an email that said, "I'm famous," in the subject line, and I was like, what are you talking about? And then below there was a link that said, here is information, I may not be quoting it exactly right, from my friend and Eyewitness. And then there was a link below. And that link below, I couldn't ever look at it because you had to be like a meetup member or something. But I have a vague recollection of actually calling my dad and saying, "Can you give me your meetup group number so I can actually look at this?" And he was able to give me that information. So I may or may not have seen what was in that link.
You mentioned you had a phone call with your father.
Yes.
How did that instruct or have influence on this response?
Okay. After my dad told me about what he was feeling and that he could hardly think, his brain was numb, and that he couldn't take a breath without feeling a stabbing sensation in his chest, and that he had rung his bell. I believe he mentioned that with this big resort and so many people on this green run, there had to be GoPro video.
Overruled?
Go ahead, continue.
And so he said there has to be GoPro footage. There just has to be, because there was this big blood-curdling scream before I got hit in the back, and that means that a person that had a helmet cam of this GoPro would look towards the scream and catch it all on video. And so I thought, that's brilliant. Then we have complete evidence of what happened and who was at fault. And so I kind of assumed that maybe this was GoPro video, and we could rest easy because we would know what happened.
But you had never, he didn't show you a GoPro video?
No, I've never seen GoPro video, and it does not exist as far as I know.
So, and now, after the CMO, you still have not seen any GoPro video?
I have not seen any GoPro video.
So I will say that this point, in my opinion, even though it doesn't show any evidence, in fact, it shows the absence of particular evidence that used to exist, I think that because of the inference, I think it really does help the defendant here. Now, what about all of the other people that were on the ski slope at the same time? Gwyneth Paltrow was there with her then boyfriend, now husband, Brad Falchuk? Wait, hang on. Okay, yeah, Brad Falchuk, along with Brad's 2 kids and along with Gwyneth's 2 kids. The kids were all around 9 and I think 14 years old. And each kid had their own private ski instructor with them. So altogether, they were a fairly large group, and arguably, she had enough people helping out with her kids so that she wasn't particularly distracted. Anyway, that's a little bit of a side quest at the moment. The point is, they were potential witnesses. On Terry Sanderson's side, he was apparently skiing with his friend Craig Ramon, which he's his Facebook friend, but maybe not like friend. I don't know. That kind of came out at trial. Regardless, Craig Ramon said that he was there and he actually saw it because he said that he was alerted to hearing Gwyneth Paltrow scream shortly before, and then 1 to 2 seconds later, he saw them collide. And according to Craig Ramon, he said that it was Gwyneth Paltrow who skied into the backside of Terry Sanderson, and then they knocked over and fell to the side. Another witness who was there around this time who comes up shortly afterwards is Eric Christensen. He is a Deer Valley Resort ski instructor, and he comes over and he's there immediately afterwards. According to Gwyneth Paltrow, she agrees that he did not actually see the incident himself. So on paper, at least, it looks like the only person who did see it was Craig Ramon. So you would think, okay, book closed, right? Craig Ramon saw it. He says that she collided into him. That's that. The only issue is when he was on the stand, there were a number of things that kind of changed in his telling of the story. For example, he said that she wasn't wearing a helmet, then later said he couldn't remember if she wasn't or was wearing a helmet, or maybe she was wearing a hat, that she also wasn't wearing goggles. Later on, we saw a photo of her from that day, and she was in fact wearing a helmet and goggles. It may seem ticky-tacky, but these are the kind of details that are going to help see if we are able to rely on the accuracy of his memory at the time of trial and even at the time of the deposition, which also was sometime after the incident itself. And that's because the jury is always going to be looking for perception issues, memory issues, and bias issues. And on the note of bias, even though he said that he wasn't like a friend, he was more of a Facebook friend, it did start to come across through his cross-examination that he was feeling a little bit bendy with some of the facts, because even if he's not a close friend of Terry's, it seemed to me personally at least that he felt very badly for what Terry has been going through and wanted to be a help to him. But the problem with that is the best way for any witness to be a help to the party that they are called by in a trial is to be as accurate and as objective in their accuracy as possible, or at least to look that way. And so when he started to sort of fight with Gwyneth Paltrow's attorney on cross-examination on some things that kind of don't even matter, some of them, it really started to look like he was, like I said, just a little bit bendy with the facts, which just makes his reliability, his credibility a little bit diminished. But one point that is more important about Craig Ramon, in my opinion, is what came out at the very end of his cross-examination, and it is that he apparently is colorblind. And by his own admission, he said that when he saw them collide, which he also said was 1 to 2 seconds after he was even alerted to it by the screaming that he said alerted him, he said that because of his colorblindness, he didn't know what color Gwyneth Paltrow was wearing, and he didn't know what color Terry Sanderson was wearing, and that at the time of the collision, it kind of just looked like one person.
You're colorblind.
Yes.
And you don't know the color, the outfit, for instance, Miss Paltrow was wearing that day. True?
True.
And you don't know the color that Terry was wearing that day. True?
True.
And when they collided, it looked like one person going down. Is that true?
Yes.
So, just how much can we rely on him to tell us who hit whom? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Now, there were some other witnesses that have testified on behalf of the plaintiff here, and that is his ex-girlfriend as well as 2 of his 3 daughters. And all of these witnesses were there to testify to the before and after the event. And of course, that's to show that before the event, his brain was great. He was super active. He was gregarious. He was this warm, lovable person.
Yeah, so I would describe my dad as a goer. I think people would describe him as fun-loving, very gregarious, definitely an extrovert.
And after the accident, after the collision, everything changed. He was agitated, easy to get angry. He got very emotional. He got all of his little things that were minor personality defects suddenly became very amplified. He was forgetful. He was vacant. He wouldn't actually communicate with people because when you would talk to him, you could tell that he's not really listening to you. He's waiting to figure out what his next sentence is going to be that he's going to be saying. So all of this testimony kind of helps to establish like I said, the before and after testimony that helps to determine just how much of his symptoms can be attributed to this particular collision. And so one thing to note here is that the experts that testified in this trial, and I anticipate other experts that will be testifying in this trial, look at the before and after testimony by these other witnesses, and they evaluate that, or they add that to their evaluation to support their conclusions for their medical diagnoses, particularly about his brain and the different functions that he is suffering with. And so that brings up this idea of garbage in, garbage out. If the information that these experts are relying on is faulty, then the conclusions that they're going to come to also will have to be faulty, or at least they won't be as strong as we would otherwise like to think. And some of this testimony that came out showed that Mr. Sanderson was a little bit close to the vest about some of the things that he was dealing with before this accident. For one thing, he had an eye injury. He's blind in his right eye from before this accident. This apparently was caused by, it's a little bit disputed, but it sounds like this was a sort of an eye stroke or something along those lines. And then there was other information about him having depression and anxiety beforehand, as well as potentially some balance issues. He also apparently 3 weeks before the accident told his primary care doctor at the VA that he said that he suddenly felt old. Now, there's a little bit more context to that particular quote in his medical documents, but that's an interesting point, and it does support the defense side, saying he already was dealing with some issues, and so you can't exactly say that his brain was in perfect health before the accident and that afterwards he's completely in shambles and that therefore it's 100% because of this accident. And then then one last thing that I can remember was the diagnosis of NPH, which is normal pressure hydrocephalus, which apparently is where you have potentially some extra fluid in the brain. Apparently it can cause some symptoms like Alzheimer's, balance issues, incontinence, and others. But there's a dispute as to whether or not he actually had these symptoms before the accident. But according to the experts that Terry Sanderson's side has put on, all of them, of course, the experts that would be put on would be helpful to his case. All of them have said that these things were, the NPH, for example, was asymptomatic. He didn't have any symptoms associated with it, but the fact that he had NPH ahead of time just made him more vulnerable to having post-concussive syndrome, meaning that he still has concussion issues, concussion-related issues today. But on the other side, on cross-examination, there has been this question that has come up that a lot of his things that he's dealing with are maybe a little bit more psychological and emotional and deal with the ways in which he's framing things. There has been testimony that came out through experts as well as through these other personal contact witnesses that said that he has become kind of obsessive with this trial. And that's something that has kind of been reinforced throughout this trial as well. This idea of obsession came up with the experts as well as with at least one of the daughters who testified. And the thing is, there also is a certain awkwardness that I really should mention, and I'll talk about it here. Up until the 4th day of trial, Terry Sanderson was not in the courtroom at all. Now, I personally very much disagree with this decision. His attorneys told the jury in their opening statement that the reason for it is because he doesn't handle, because of the state that he's in right now, because of the mental state, the brain functioning state that he's in, he doesn't handle hearing criticism about himself very well.
We asked Terry to step out during this part because I didn't want to rub his nose in his own problems. And during other parts of testimony from his daughters and some of the other before and after witnesses, Terry won't be in the courtroom.
The thing about that, though, is that it sounds like a very, very weak excuse. I can understand some trials that talk about some very difficult topics. I mean, we've talked on this channel about SA, we've talked about the Harvey Weinstein trials, things like that can be incredibly difficult to sit through. And so I can understand in some contexts where the testimony that comes out is just too difficult for someone to bear. As an example, Kobe Bryant's wife in her case against the Los Angeles County Police and Fire Department about the images of Kobe Bryant and her daughter Jonna Bryant at the helicopter crash site. That case, she had to step out during certain parts of testimony because of the gruesomeness of that trial. And that's completely understandable. But in this case, we're talking about people talking about how his personality has changed, how he doesn't have the same sort of functionality right now that he used to have. And the thing is, out of every single person in that courtroom, other than, maybe people that just wanted to come and watch the trial in the gallery, every single person in that courtroom is there because they have to be, because they are required to be. The defendant is there because she has been sued. She can't just decide not to show up for trial, not to participate in trial. The jurors are also required to be there by a court order. Everyone else has to be there except for him. He's the one that chose to file this lawsuit. He's the one that chose to proceed with litigation and to proceed all the way to trial. And so as a default matter, it is a very bad look, in my opinion, for the plaintiff in a civil case to tell the jury, I want you to put your life on pause for a couple weeks of your life, and I want you to make this woman over there give me money. But I'm not going to sit through this trial. I'm not going to actually sit here with you while you evaluate all of this evidence for hours and hours and days on end. And how this ties back into the obsession point is his first moment when he showed up in court was not during his daughter's testimony, not his ex-wife's testimony, not any of the experts' testimony, not any of his friends or there was another family member that testified too. It was Gwyneth Paltrow's testimony. And not only that, but at one point, his attorneys wanted Gwyneth Paltrow during her testimony to come down from the witness stand and to do like a demonstrative in the courtroom to show like how the collision happened. And then when she refused and when her attorney objected and the judge sustained the objection, they decided to do a demonstrative with the attorney that was asking her questions, and they tried to volunteer Terry Sanderson to participate.
You can
is that
walk to where
okay?
you can see better. You can walk further forward, Ms. Van
Oh,
Horn.
sure. Great. Now that Mr. Sanderson is here, and I don't need you to do anything, Terry, but just for comparison's sake, I'm in my heels. We're about the same height, about 5'5" with heels.
It's roughly.
Oh, tell me I'm taller, please. Okay, we've got Mr. Sanderson that's about 5'5" that comes in back of you, and you said that you felt something huge. What was your word behind you?
Just a big body.
A big body. All right. And was it just the front of his body that touched the back of your body?
I couldn't see in the back of my head.
Sure.
But I felt a body press against my back.
But there was no grabbing, like he didn't like grab your waist or grab your arms?
No, not at all. No.
Nothing like that?
Nothing.
Okay.
The whole part of that is weird. Not only does his potential participation in this demonstrative make it seem way less likely that the reason why he wasn't in the courtroom was because he was too vulnerable. At the same time, it also makes it seem like his first appearance in the courtroom at all is to watch a celebrity, and specifically to watch a celebrity talk about her encounter with him. Now, you might be thinking that I'm making a big deal about this, but the thing is, one piece of evidence that came out early on was an email that he had sent to his daughters shortly after the collision. Maybe not shortly, 8 hours after the collision. That was titled, "I'm Famous." And that's the email where he sent to his daughters the link that apparently had a video that then went missing. And there have been suggestions in other pieces of testimony that he has been kind of happy about the fact that he's showing up in press releases and people are talking about him. There's Google searches and all this kind of stuff. And so all of that put together kind of makes me think that there is a good possibility here that he may have been responsible for this accident, and he may have just had a hard time coming to terms with the fact that he is responsible through his own actions or through his lack of luck even for ending up in a place where he's not able to do the things that he used to love to do. And that has really harmed his sense of self and the way in which he sees himself and his value and his personal worth. And the question is Gwyneth Paltrow responsible for that? So all of that said, here's basically where I've landed so far. There are a lot of things that have happened in this trial that I would have liked to have seen done differently. Opening statements were something. There have been a lot of impeachments of witnesses that have been very frustrating to watch. The efforts to make Gwyneth Paltrow a relatable witness is not exactly how I would have gone about it. And a lot of the procedure that's just happened in this case has been interesting. I'll just put it that way. And truth be told, this trial is not over. It's technically not even halfway over. On the plaintiff's side, they've called all of their witnesses, including Gwyneth Paltrow, except for the plaintiff. Terry Sanderson is set to testify on Monday, and it is going to be very, very interesting to see. But based on the evidence that has come out so far, I don't know that there really is enough for plaintiff to have met his burden. Even with his chief eyewitness, Craig Ramon, testifying as to what he saw, I'm not entirely convinced that he actually saw the collision or that he saw clearly what happened. When it comes to the daughters, I forgot to mention there is a third daughter who has not testified yet and might testify. The defense is trying to get her because she gives a very different account as to what kind of personality their father had as opposed to what her sisters say. In other words, being a bit more controlling, quick to anger, all of these things that are relatively similar to how they describe him after the accident. But references to her differences of opinion have come up in the other testimonies. And so for me personally, I think the one thing that the plaintiff might have a decent shot at this point right now so far is they've done a decent job of trying to point to his pre-existing conditions and framing those as eggshell skull conditions. In other words, just showing that he is a vulnerable person who was susceptible to greater injury from this kind of an impact. But other than that, I'm not entirely convinced that the experts that have come on are able to very credibly tell who hit whom, because part of what they were relying on was these other witnesses that testified to his personality changes, and there's some dispute there. And there have also been other indications about his physical conditions prior to the accident. Things like the word osteoporosis has come up that I would expect to hear more about from the expert witnesses on Gwyneth Paltrow's side in her case in chief. And the thing is, at this point in the trial, I would say at the end of Terry Sanderson's testimony, the jury should be feeling like this case is in the bag for the plaintiff, 100% siding with the plaintiff. And that's because that's their case in chief. It's their chance to put on their witnesses to tell the story for the plaintiff. And usually what happens is then the ball is in the defense court in their case in chief, and they have the opportunity to sort of swing the pendulum back towards their side with their evidence that they put on. But if at this point you don't really feel like the plaintiff really has a good case, it's not a good sign at this point in the litigation. So although I will be keeping my eyes and ears open for the rest of this trial to see what evidence comes out, maybe my opinion will change based on the evidence that does come out in the rest of this trial. I don't know. Those are my thoughts for right now. But what do you think? If you saw Gwyneth Paltrow's testimony, do you think that she's telling the truth? Do you think that she comes across as accurate, believable, reliable? Do you think that Craig Ramon, the Facebook friend of the plaintiff, actually did see the crash clearly enough to be able to tell who hit whom? And do you side with the plaintiff or the defense in this case at this point? Either way, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you want to see more stuff like this and you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. See you in the next video.